This video introduces monitoring process activity. Here we learn about what is load average and the utilities to display it and other process information, and the use of the top utility. In your book, there's a good section and definition of load average. The Linux kernel defines load average as a metric, calculates a load average metric as an exponential moving average of the load number, a cumulative CPU count of active system resource requests. Okay, that's a mouthful. An active request first is something that is runnable, something that is ready to do work. It is not something that is waiting on I/O. It's actually ready to be put on the CPU. Those are active requests. Now, in addition to runnable, those threads that are ready to do work but are blocked, that they're actually waiting on I/O or input from a screen or input from a disk, they too will get to work as soon as they get their I/O satisfied, so they are also considered to be an active request. Any other threads and processes that are not doing work don't count. The load number itself is a calculation. We run it roughly every 5 seconds, usually. It basically accumulates and makes an average of these active requests to get a single number. And we do it across all CPUs. The term exponential moving average is just a formula. But what's important about it is it's used to smooth out spikes, data highs and lows. But it also gives more significance to current data than it does aging data. And finally, the load average is taking those load numbers in that calculation and giving us a result, the average of it all. And collectively, this refers to what you see on a lot of commands as 3 numbers, like the W command. Notice on the first line here at the top, the load average on the right. So those 3 numbers are the load average calculated for the last minute, the last 5 minutes, and the last 15 minutes. So when we talk about load average, we're mostly referring to those 3 numbers in our interpretation of how loaded the system is. So there's a lot of technical stuff behind the load average calculation, and there's a lot of stuff you can read of white papers and technical papers about it to try to make it the most simple thing. Here's what you need to know. First, Linux actually counts threads individually, not just counting processes, but each thread of execution is a task to do something that is countable. So we count threads individually. In addition to this, there are request queues for each CPUs to keep track of what is waiting to run, the running threads or the runnable threads. And there's also a queue to keep track of those that are waiting for I/O resources that as soon as they get their I/O, they want to get to work. And those 2 queues correspond to something you learned earlier in the process states about being the running state and the sleeping state. Waiting for I/O is task sleeping, waiting for expected disk or network response. Okay, next, this load number is a global counter calculation. What that means is we take the count of the running queues from all the CPUs and we put it together. One of the reasons why we do it this way is because things can migrate from one CPU to another, it is actually difficult to get an accurate count on a per CPU basis, but we can guarantee that the total count across all of them is accurate. So we do this load number as a global counter calculation. Now, in addition to counting threads individually, we also count the hardware that we process on, the CPUs, individually. So each core and microprocessor hyperthread is counted as a separate execution unit. So we're just going to use the term logical CPU to represent that. So we count all the logical CPUs to decide all the places where we can do running of threads. Now, if we have 1 thread per logical CPU, then we keep the system busy. If we have more than 1 thread waiting per CPU, the system could be considered overloaded. It's as simple as that. First, we want to know, how many CPUs do we have? And in the example in your book, we did a grepping for the word model name in the proc CPU info file. And we found that on that particular system, there were 4 cores. If I do this on my own system, This one only has, I'm working in a virtual machine that only has one core, so it's kind of hard to calculate, to show calculations based on multiple. So I'm going to stay with the book where there were 4 cores. So chances are this was a single chip, a single socket with a dual core hyper-threaded chip. So that's a total of 2 threads per core, 2 cores. So it looks like 4 CPUs because it's 4 logical CPUs. So the count is 4 CPUs. Now, back in the Unix days, on other Unixes, some Unixes only looked at CPU utilization as a calculation of load factor. But one of the things we've realized here in Linux is if you have a system that has no load on it, that there's no CPU activity, I should say, yet you have a lot of activity that is waiting on disk I/O, your users will perceive a delay. They will perceive that there appears to be a load because they're waiting. So it's important to not just include CPU busyness, but to also include other things that are waiting. This is why we don't just count the runnable queue, but we also count the block queue, which is waiting on I/O. The commands that we use to display this, we already looked at W. Uptime is another one. The GNOME system monitor is another one that display load average. So you can see it in a number of different places. Here's what you do with it. You take those numbers and you divide them by the number of CPUs, logical, that you have. Because think about it. If I have 4 outstanding things to do and I have 4 processors, gee, that sounds perfect. And it's not just one process per CPU, but over time, one process will be done and another thing will be scheduled. So it can be lots of processes over the course of a certain amount of time frame, seconds. So as long as things are lining up and get onto the CPU quickly and there's no saturation, there's no people waiting in line, then you have enough CPU to handle the load. So the idea is you look at these numbers and you divide them by the number of CPUs, because remember it's a global count. You divide by the CPUs. If the result is 1 or less, then you're basically saying that there's nobody waiting. There's one person, they get onto the CPU, or there's one task. They get onto the CPU, that's it. So if you take your load average and you divide it by the number of CPUs, you'll get a number that is either 1 or less or possibly greater than 1. If greater than 1, then what you're saying is you have 2 or more, over 1 per CPU, which means that some of those are standing in line waiting. They're in the queues waiting, which can be interpreted as being overloaded. Load average. If those numbers are just a little bit over 1 and they tend to fluctuate and they go down under 1, then okay, you just have some congestion sometimes. It's when it stays up above a calculation of 1 consistently that you have things waiting in queue and you seem to have more work than should be done on this machine, and hence we should do some tuning. So the idea is that load average, when it stays above 1 as the calculation per CPU, that gives you an indication that your system is loaded and possibly needs other performance tuning. So that's a general description of load average. I would suggest going back through the book and reading that section a couple times slowly to make sure that the concepts sink in. It's actually a very simple calculation or a very simple metric to use. And when you go out and do research on it, you'll find that many people have written a lot of different papers on it. Make sure that as you do research that you're looking for that which pertains to Linux, because some of the discussions you'll find about Unix did it differently. So we saw uptime and we saw W to see this. The other command that we want to use right now is top. Top is one of our favorite commands for monitoring what's going on in the system, and we'll see load average with it also, but we'll also look at other process information. So let's run a top here. The nice thing about top, it looks like a PS listing, but it's dynamic. It shows some basic, summary information at the top of the list and then shows a process listing. Now this sorts by, the default is to sort by those processes using the most CPU. So we're seeing what's interesting to us on the screen right now, and a lot of things that are uninteresting. I mean, there's the hundreds of processes running. We're obviously not seeing them all, but we're not getting them on the screen because they don't fit. So you can scroll through more screens, but it's very common that you will just resort to, I want to look at it by memory, I want to look at it by CPU, I want to look at it by user. Normally you filter and sort top to look at what you want to see. You don't go scrolling through lists like you do with PS. Still though, let me give you a short introduction to some of the keystrokes. And if you can't remember them, don't forget that help is in top, you get help with H. So here's a summary of lots of the keystrokes that you might use. Notice down at the bottom, to get out of help, Q to quit or escape. So let's just do a Q to quit help without quitting top. To quit top, it's another Q. So just some examples. And again, you can look at the man pages or other documentation. There's a lot of things that this can do, but we'll just look at some of the fundamentals. First, the summary's up at the top. You can use these toggle keystrokes. L, you see that first line that is a load average line? That can be toggled on and off with an L. Toggle it off, toggle it on. The task line can be toggled on and off with a T. And the memory line, the last two lines, can be toggled on and off with a lowercase m. Now you're noticing that this seems to be refreshing every couple of seconds. You can modify the refresh rate to make it longer or slower by using D for decimal and giving a number. And I like the refresh rate the way it is, so I'm going to leave it. Do you see that bolded line that says that is of state R for running? Which notice that while top is running, it always catches itself as being what's on the CPU. Ah, I just saw another R show up. The number of things that can be running at one time is equivalent to the number of CPUs that are on this machine. So if you have a 4 CPU system, you might see up to 4 R's in this list all at the same time. But if you want to see that highlighted a little bit better, you can do B for, it's a reverse bolding. Notice all those that are R's show up in dark now. And again, you can toggle that way on and off. There's just regular bold, but there's the reverse bolding that's a little bit more easy to notice. Capital B turns on and off the use of bold overall. Notice that? Capital B for bolding, lowercase b for that highlighted bold. You can look at this as processes, or you can look at it as threads. You can see the thread summary of processes. You can also sort this. You can rearrange the columns. Notice that it's sorting right now by CPU, the highest CPU usage. I can sort by memory usage by doing a capital M. So this will sort by those which use the most memory. Look at that. A lot of times that which is using the most memory may also be using the most CPU. So a lot of times we get the same things up at the top of the list, but it's not quite the same. To resort by CPU, we did capital M to sort by memory. To resort by CPU is capital P for by processor, capital P. That goes back to a CPU, which is the default we came in as. Now, from here, we can actually manage processes. Earlier, we used command line to kill stuff off. You can kill stuff from here. Let me open up another window and let me start, let's start a DD process. Let's take input from the dev0 device and send it out to dev null. This is going to generate CPU activity without actually doing anything, and it'll just keep running. So that's using up CPU, and I should see it in my top listing. There it is right at the top. It's using up a lot of CPU, almost 100% of the CPU. So if I want to kill that off, there are a couple ways to do it, but the easiest right now, can you see the process ID of that process on the left-hand side? K for kill. It then says which signal do you want to use. And the default kill signal is a 15. The hardcore kill signal is a 9. I'm just going to do the default. And notice that it's assuming that what's on top is the process that you want to default to, or I can type it in. Let me just type it in even though it is the default. You say the process ID that you want to kill, and then you say the signal, and again, 15 is the default. And it kills off that process. So that concludes the introduction to monitoring process activity.